Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Meg Gray. I'm the head of the reference department here at Bangor Public Library. This library is in the traditional homeland, past and present, of the Penobscot tribe. The Bangor Public Library recognizes and respects the sovereignty of the Penobscot Nation and coordinates programming about the history, people, government, and culture of the Penobscot with proper tribal authorities. Tonight's program, Through a Glass Darkly, Maine's HHRC archives illuminate the struggle of even prominent Jews to find refuge in America in a very dark era, is the final event in a series of programs in conjunction with the Americans in the Holocaust exhibition. As you may know, Bangor Public Library is one of 50 libraries selected by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Library Association to host Americans in the Holocaust. The exhibition, on view in the Minsky Lecture Hall until this Saturday, January 15th at 5 o'clock, examines the motives, pressures, and fears that shaped Americans' responses to Nazism, war, and genocide from 1933 to 1945. Americans in the Holocaust explores four main questions. What did Americans know? Did Americans help Jewish refugees? Why did Americans go to war? And how did Americans respond to the Holocaust? We hope that the exhibition in our lecture tonight provokes new questions and opportunities to reflect upon these questions, both in regard to the history and our roles and responsibilities today. Questions like, what is the relationship between knowledge and action? And how do we balance humanitarian concerns with political realities? And finally, what are the pressures and motivations that influence individual behavior? On behalf of myself and the staff here at Bangor Public Library, we want to thank you for joining us and asking tough questions about America's role in this history and our role as citizens of the world today. After the program, we hope that you continue to engage with the history, visit the exhibit, and as always, read more books. We are proud to bring this exhibition to the Bangor community, and we look forward to conversations it will spark. So tonight, we're thrilled to have Erica Nadelhoft with us this evening. Erica is the education coordinator at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. And she's also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Maine, Fort Kent. And most importantly, she grew up here in Bangor and had her first library card here at Bangor Public Library. Thanks for joining us, Erica.
Thank you. And good evening, everyone. And I noticed so many people that I know from childhood all the way on up until present day who are there. So the pressure is on me to do a really good job. So tonight's talk is less of a lecture, and it's really more of a story. And the story began for me back in April at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center in Augusta, where I work. Over the years, people and organizations have donated artifacts and papers and all sorts of miscellaneous items to the center. And while everything was neatly and safely stored, a lack of time, staff, and the right technology had meant that we hadn't been able to properly sort through and archive much of what we had. But last April, the stars aligned, and our executive director, Tam, our operations manager, Phil, and I all met to start the project of sorting, cataloging, and digitizing our collections. Now, me being me, I gravitated quickly to the various boxes of papers and documents. I pulled out one manila folder that contained newspaper clippings, letters, and a typewritten note that said simply, the Muehsam letters. These letters, all from a collection of Dr. Edward Muehsam, tell the story of three families' efforts to escape Nazi Germany. And that was it. I could find no record of where the letters came from or why they were in our archives. But I knew that somewhere in this box was a story. And in the box, there was a fragile booklet that contained a family tree from 1912 and a bunch of newspaper clippings from the late 1920s. And there were 8 letters. All the letters went in one direction, from Europe to New York. 7 were in English, 1 was in German. Some were typed, others were handwritten. And honestly, I was not much help to Tam and Phil after that, because I simply picked up the box and wandered off into a corner and started to read. And in this cardboard box, I found pieces of 3 stories stories that played out over and over again throughout Germany and other parts of Europe, including in my own family, as Jews desperate to flee Germany for the United States tried to meet the increasingly difficult visa requirements and wrote letter after letter to relatives in the United States in search of affidavits of support that would be enough to let them in. So here are the stories from this particular box. And the story actually begins in 1927, before the Nazis came to power, when Dr. Hans Werner Muehsam, who lived in Berlin, sold his father Jacques' world-famous glass collection. And this was a major event in the art world. The collection, which was known as the Jacques Muehsam collection, comprised some 750 pieces of glass from the mid-15th to the mid-19th centuries. And the collection included pieces such as a goblet dedicated to Dutch painter Jan Steen and signed in 1676, the first known piece of German cut glass from 1592, and a beaker given to Voltaire by Frederick the Great. And the collection was sold for $140,000, which would be over $2 million today. And it was split between the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Chicago Art Institute. And it was a very big deal. The sale was reported in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Sun, and the Washington Sun, among other newspapers. And James Thurber wrote an article about the collection in a 1928 issue of the New Yorker. And the newspaper clippings I found in this box are all about the sale. And along with the clippings, there was a battered pamphlet from 1912. And the pamphlet was a history of the Muehsam family from the early 18th century onward. And the Muehsams, it's clear, were a family whose roots went back many centuries in Germany. They were professionals, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, bankers, and professors. As we will see, though, neither their long history in Germany, nor their middle and upper middle class, and even upper class status, nor their family connections to this famous art collection offered them any protection once the Nazis came to power in 1933. But what about the letters in this box? As I said, there were 8 total, and they came from 3 separate branches of the Muehsam family. They were all addressed to the same relative in New York, Dr. Edward J. Muehsam of 134 West 67th Street in New York City. And all the letters were requesting an affidavit of financial support that could be submitted to the American consulate in the hopes of qualifying for a visa to enter the United States. All 3 of the letter writers lived in Berlin, and they began their quest for a visa at the American consulate there. Now, it wasn't easy for a German Jew to obtain a visa to immigrate to the United States. Between 1933 and 1939, approximately 300,000 German Jews applied for visas to the United States. Out of this number, only 75,000 were granted visas. And yet, the actual allowed number of visas for that time period was 183,112, which means that only 40.48% of the quota was filled. Now, we actually know quite a bit about the American diplomats who worked at the Berlin consulate during these years. One of the Foreign Service officers who served in Berlin from 1929 onward was a man named Raymond Geist. Based on his letters and other correspondence from the time, it appears that Geist was deeply affected by the anti-Semitism that we know was entrenched in much of the US Foreign Service, not to mention other parts of the government and the country as a whole. It's well known that this anti-Semitism affected the decisions of Foreign Service officers in Berlin and elsewhere. And Geist especially applied a severely restrictive immigration policy to German Jewish visa applicants. Some of the arguments that were put forward by Geist in Berlin and elsewhere for rejecting applications were as follows. There was the claim that granting visas would violate the likely to become a public charge provision. This provision was the reason that so many Jews, including the Muehsams, were desperately seeking affidavits of support from family and friends already in the United States. And then there was the claim that a huge influx of German Jewish immigrants would exacerbate the severe unemployment in the United States that had been brought about by the Great Depression. And the claim that many refugees were political radicals, read Bolsheviks, often a code for Jews, but as such posed a threat to national security. And finally, there was the claim that the refugee issue was a Jewish problem, which the United States had neither the obligation nor the responsibility to solve. The visa application itself was 7 pages long. Jews had to provide documentation in support of their application, which included, among other things, documents proving that they were able-bodied, of sound mind, and had no criminal record. As time went on, it became increasingly difficult for Jews to get this documentation from the Nazi government. As a Foreign Service officer in Berlin, Geist was well aware that German Jews faced major difficulties in acquiring the documents necessary to support their visa applications. Despite this, he repeatedly cautioned his superiors about relaxing the document requirements because he feared that to do so would increase the risk of fraud by undesirable persons. And even though Geist professed sympathy for Jews, after he saw firsthand the effects of Kristallnacht, he did not change his attitude regarding visas. Now, the piece in the application process that's most relevant for this talk is the provision that required German Jews to prove that they would not become a public charge once they arrived in the United States. And the burden of proof rested with those applying for a visa. They had to provide detailed information about themselves and document that they had substantial financial ability and that they would be able to support themselves and their families for an indefinite period of time after their arrival in the country. This obviously became increasingly difficult after 1933 as the Nazis stripped Jews of their jobs, their possessions, their bank accounts, and other resources. American relatives were allowed to submit sponsor affidavits on applicants' behalf. These American sponsors also had to present supporting documentation verifying their financial ability and their willingness to support the visa applicant. This included providing a copy of their most recent federal tax returns, a statement from their bank confirming the balance in their bank accounts, and an affidavit from another responsible person, preferably their employer, verifying the sponsor's financial status. Many Foreign Service officers, including Geist, were reluctant to approve affidavits from non-family members, despite no matter what their financial status was. So when the various branches of the Muehsam family in Berlin began their quest for a visa to enter the United States, Geist and his colleagues were the ones they had to work with. So I'm going to start with the 2 letters written by a Dr. Werner Muehsam, who was a medical doctor in Germany. The first, written in German to his cousin Edward Muehsam, different spelling, in New York, was dated October 24th, 1938, and it was sent from Berlin. And in this typewritten letter, Edward thanked his cousin for the affidavit that he had sent for him and his son, and said he was hopeful that it would help them to emigrate to the United States. The letter was short and to the point. It was filled with words of gratitude for the affidavit and expressed the writer's desire for a quick exit from Germany and his hope that someday he would be able to meet and thank his cousin in person. Now, the next letter from Eduard to his cousin is dated June 22nd, 1940. And this time, the letter is written in English and it comes from London. How and when Eduard and his son got to London, I do not know. I could not find out. But in this letter, he thanked his cousin for having sent yet another renewed affidavit. He wrote that his papers were in the best order and had been examined a long time ago in Berlin, but since they dated from 1938, the consul had asked more than once for what he referred to as a revival of the documents. And this happened frequently to many Jews who were applying for visas. Because the process took a very long time, often by the time they moved up in the long queue for an appointment with the consul, the documents that they had gathered when they started the process had expired, and they were forced to begin collecting them all over again. So in his letter, Eduard wrote, "I hope and trust to get the visa in the near future. I will come over to the United States with my son immediately and am cheerful knowing that in your hospitable country, I am allowed to start over and to take the medical examinations." And Eduard also mentioned for the first time that he was with his mother as well as his son. And he concluded this letter by saying once again that he hoped to meet with his cousin. And he added, and I quote, "You can only imagine what we suffered since I came from the concentration camp in Germany, only for being a Jew." And that last sentence about his time in a concentration camp appears out of nowhere, and there is no further explanation. But given the timing and his place of residence, it's possible that Eduard was one of the 30,000 Jews arrested and sent to Dachau following Kristallnacht in 1938. And I did try to find out if that was the case. I was able to find a list of prisoners at Dachau in 1938 and 1939 that was in a ledger that the United States Army had confiscated when the camp was liberated. But unfortunately for me and for this talk, the list is only available for viewing in person on microfiche at the National Archives. And so it remains tantalizingly out of reach at the moment. But that's the end of the letters from Eduard Muehsam. It's all that was in the box. But what happened to him and his family? Finding out what happened to Eduard, to his mother and his son, and to the other letter writers that I'll talk about, took a whole lot of digging. But here's what I found. Eduard received his visa to enter the United States from the London consulate on August 2nd, 1940. And his son, Gerhard Ernst, received his visa on August 7th. The two of them sailed from Glasgow that same month on the ship Cameronia and entered the United States through Ellis Island. At the time, Eduard was 42 and his son Gerhard was 16. Eduard's mother did not come with them. She didn't receive a visa until December 1942, and she was able to sail from Liverpool on April 24th, 1943, at the age of 67. I cannot say for sure why Eduard's mother came so much later. We do know from his letters that the affidavit that he had received from his cousin in New York only sponsored him and his son. So perhaps his mother needed to wait until Eduard himself was settled in New York and he could sponsor her. Once in the United States, Eduard returned to medicine as a urologist and a surgeon. His son Gerhart joined the US Army in August 1943. And Eduard lived until June 23rd, 1977, when he died in New York. His mother lived until 1967, and his son Gerhard lived until 1992. Now, I have an interesting aside about Edward, since you never really know what bits of information you're going to pick up when you're researching into someone's life. Edward remarried when he was in New York. His son's mother, Lily, had remained in England, and it's unclear whether she traveled with Edward and her son to England, where they then divorced, or whether they had divorced earlier. But in any event, in 1946 in New York, Edward married a woman named Dr. Margaret Therese, and she was an incredibly interesting woman in her own right. She was born in Berlin. She had a degree in law, and she worked in Berlin as a lawyer, a journalist, and a newspaper editor. And for a time, she even served as a city councilor in Berlin. She emigrated to the United States in 1938, and she was able to get a visa quickly and easily because a member of the American embassy had personally given affidavits of support to all the Jewish members on the editorial staff of the newspaper at which she was editor-in-chief. In the United States, Margaret was one of the early members of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York from its establishment in 1955 until her death. She was a founding member of its Women's Auxiliary. She edited the Leo Baeck Institute News. She oversaw the Institute's public relations department, and she served on the board following her retirement. So Edward married quite well. Now, the next two letters that I found in this box came from a man named Ernst Schott, and they too were written to Dr. Edward J. Muehsam in New York City. And the first letter, written in English on July 25th, 1939, came from Berlin. And Ernst Schott began by introducing himself, and he wrote, I quote, "Because I am a relationship of you, allow me to ask you for a pro forma edition affidavit." And he wrote that all the Muehsams in the world descended from one ancestor, Pincus Seligman Pappenheim, who had received the name Muehsam from Frederick the Great. And he gave a detailed family history in the letter in order to prove his connection to the Muehsam family in general and to Dr. Edward in New York in particular. And his connection, which I verified in the Muehsam family tree that I found in our archives, came through his grandmother. And Ernst was writing, he said, because he, his wife Hedwig, and his daughter Ava were trying, like so many others, to get out of Germany. Now, Ernst Schott had already received an affidavit from his sister, who had been living in New York since 1912. But the American consulate in Berlin had told him, however, that this affidavit, which was for $5,737.40, the sum total of his sister's bank account, was not a high enough sum of money, and that he needed another affidavit of at least $5,000 for his family to be eligible for a visa. So in the letter that he sent to New York, Ernst promised that neither he nor his sister would ever claim the money that he was asking Edward to guarantee in the affidavit. And he gave his sisters and his brothers addresses in New York and asked that Edward contact them for confirmation of their support. Now, Ernst provided a great deal of information about himself and his family in this first letter. And at the time of its writing, he was 49, and he was a German shoe expert who worked as a buyer in what he referred to as Berlin's greatest shoe company, the firm Leiser. He said his wife Hedwig was in the beauty field, and his 18-year-old daughter Ava was a photographer. And according to Ernst, both his wife and his daughter had offers of employment waiting for them in New York. On August 28th, 1939, Ernst wrote to Edward Muehsam again, and he was very excited in this letter to have received word from Edward in a letter dated August 17th, in which he heard that Edward was going to submit an affidavit the following week. "I thank you with all my heart," he wrote. "I will never forget it in this life." But then once again, the letters end. That's all there was. So once again, I started digging. And I eventually found a testimony that Ernst's daughter Eva had written many decades later, and it was very detailed. And Eva first described what life had been like in Berlin before they were able to escape. She described being forced to leave school at the age of 14. She remembered many Jewish families being deported from Berlin, and she wondered if her family was spared because they lived in a Catholic neighborhood and her father was a World War I veteran. Eva remembered her parents having to sell their possessions to survive after they had both been forced out of work. She said that her father's former employer, Mr. Grevenstein, whom she describes as a devout Catholic, used to come to their apartment at night. He would throw pebbles up at their windows, and her father would go down to the front door, where Mr. Grevenstein would give them a package containing forbidden canned goods. In this account, Eva remembered that her family received affidavits from her father's brother and sister who lived in the United States. But in this one, she doesn't mention the affidavit that came from Dr. Edward. In another account, however, she does mention an affidavit from her father's cousin. She also remembers that as part of their application for a visa at the American consulate in Berlin, they had to swear they weren't idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, prostitutes, or anarchists. Now, the Schott family was able to leave Berlin by train with a few suitcases and the equivalent of $11 on July 14th, 1940, and they were able to get as far as Latvia. Eva's grandparents were not able to go with them, and they died in the extermination camps. Now, at this time in 1940, the Germans were not letting Jews leave through Europe, so the family continued by train into the Soviet Union. Because of the non-aggression pact that Germany and the Soviet Union had signed, that route was one of the few still open to fleeing Jews. The Schotts made it to Moscow, where they switched to the Siberian Express train for a 7-day journey across the Soviet Union. The Soviet authorities provided them with meal coupons, but Eva remembers there was still not enough to eat. She remembered, though, that the train was filled with wounded Soviet soldiers who were returning home from the Winter War with Finland. Some of the soldiers, she said, noticed that her family did not have breakfast and brought them eggs and Russian bread. After crossing from Russia into Manchuria, the family took what was called the Japan Express to a stop in Harbin in China. There, a Jewish community group prepared dinner for them and the other refugees who were on the train. The train journey then continued, and following a 4-day stop in Kobe, Japan, they continued on to Yokohama, where they boarded the ocean liner known as the Rakuyo Maru. And the Schott family then traveled steerage with approximately 150 other people. They had bunk beds with little curtains, and they ate fish 3 times a day and nothing else. This sea journey took 3 weeks, and the Schott family arrived at Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco on August 28, 1940. But their ordeal was not yet over, because even though the family had valid visas to enter the United States, they still had to prove that they would not become public charges. They had virtually no money on arrival, so they were detained while the American authorities determined that the money promised in those affidavits would be enough. While this was going on, Ernst was separated from his wife and daughter and sent to the detention barracks. Eva and her mother Hedvig were kept at the Angel Island Immigration Station Hospital. While there, Eva turned 19. The family was there for 9 days, and notes from the immigration officials show that the authorities were concerned that the New York relatives would not be able to provide enough money for them to be settled. But finally, in the end, the family was released to Jewish charitable groups in San Francisco. Ava married in late 1943. She and her parents became citizens of the United States in 1946. Ernst died in San Francisco in January of 1962, but I wasn't able to find the records of either Hedwig or Ava's deaths. But now to the third story, the one that was the hardest for me. And this is the story of Hans Werner Muehsam, the son of Jacques Muehsam, the one who sold his father's glass collection back in 1927. Now, Hans Werner first wrote to his cousin Edward Muehsam in New York on December 22nd, 1938. And in this letter, he reminded his cousin Edward of their correspondence from back in 1933 when they had discussed putting out a new edition of their family chronicle. And he apologized for the fact that there would not be a second edition of this family history because, as he wrote, things have changed a lot and we are all desirous of leaving the fatherland. Hans wrote in this letter that he planned to go to the United States, and he reminded his cousin that, yes, this was where he had sold his father's glass collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he enclosed the very newspaper clippings that eventually made their way into our archives, and he asked that Dr. Edward return them as soon as possible. Hans continued on in his letter to say that he had received an affidavit from a friend of his father's, whom he identified in a later letter as Alan Bond of 60 Beaver Street in New York. But as Mr. Bond was over 70, Hans wrote, the American consulate in Berlin was requiring yet another affidavit from a relative. And like the other writers before him, he swore to his cousin that he would never claim the money promised in the affidavit and that it was a mere formality as part of the visa application. He asked his cousin Edward to file the affidavit before any notary public in the United States. And he concluded this letter by saying, again, like the others, that he hoped to thank Edward personally when he finally arrived in the United States. But he said, this will take some time as the quota is taken up for a couple of years. But while he was applying for a new visa, he said, he was also trying to have an old permit that he once had to enter the United States renewed. And he wrote, if I get the renewal, I'll be in New York next fall. On March 23rd, 1939, Hans wrote to Edward again, expressing the hope that Edward had received his earlier letter because he had not yet gotten a reply. He reiterated all that he had said in that first letter, still expressing the hope that he might be able to have his old reentry permit from 1927 renewed. He was so hopeful, writing that when I succeed, I will need no affidavit at all, but will be able to enter as a non-quota immigrant. He provided in this letter some more information, mentioning that he was 35, still unmarried, born in Berlin, and that he would appreciate his cousin's kindness very much. On May 8th, 1939, Hans wrote to his cousin Edward yet again, thanking him for his letter of April 28th that had come with the affidavit. It's clear from Hans's letter, from this third letter, that procuring a visa was not as easy a task as he had hoped. And he wrote, it's rather difficult to liquidate things in Berlin and to get through the different authorities, but I hasten to leave Germany soon. First, I'll go with my mother, who is 73 years old, to England, where we have relatives. And I assume that he means his cousin Edward and the son Gerhart, whom I talked about earlier, who were in London. From London, Hans writes, I will try to enter the States as early as possible. My registration number is rather a high one, but I hope to get over sooner than later. More than a year later, on August 24th, 1940, Hans wrote again. He said that he was still in Berlin and still anxiously waiting to get his visa to enter the United States. His registration number at that time was 48,199. And as he said, the officials of the consulate are working very slowly, and I don't see a chance to come over before the beginning of next year. He went on to say that he had been informed that the consul would only accept affidavits that are no older than 1 year. Because of this, he had to ask his cousin to, and I quote, instantly renew the affidavit that he had already given. He also needed a new certificate from Edward's employer because the first one he had submitted was now regarded as out of date. And you can start to sense his fear when you read this letter. And he writes, if there are any obstacles, let me know at your earliest convenience, as I need an affidavit of a relative very urgently. Please oblige me by sending all mail by air. And there the letters from the box end. On a piece of paper that was included with these letters in our archives, there was a note that simply said that Hans and his mother died in the Holocaust sometime after 1943. So what happened to Hans and his mother? For them, unlike the other two families, there was no escape. And it actually took me quite a while to trace them. Hans's mother, whose name I discovered was Agnes, was deported on transport 1/91 from Berlin to Theresienstadt on April 19, 1943. Her name is found on a list of Jews deported from Germany and again on a list of prisoners at Theresienstadt, and she died sometime after that. It took even more digging for me to find out what happened to Hans. For the longest time, all I could find was a date and a place of death, Hamburg, May 3rd, 1945. May 3rd, 1945, so close to the end of the war. After much searching, I found Hans' death recorded on a list written in German titled Registration of Foreigners and German Persecutees from 1939 to 1947. The place of Hans Muehsam's death is listed as Neuengamme, and the cause of death was listed as drowning. I then found another record from the Civil Registration Office in Hamburg that listed Hans' place of death as the Neuengamme concentration camp. But how did he drown? As the British were approaching Hamburg and the Neuengamme camp in early May, the Nazis began to evacuate the prisoners. Some 9,000 to 10,000 prisoners were loaded onto 3 ships that had been anchored in the Baltic Sea. Over 7,000 of these prisoners lost their lives when the British bombed 2 of the ships in a raid on the harbor where they were anchored on May 3rd. One of the ships, the Thielbeck, sank quickly with 2,000 prisoners on board. The other ship, the Cap Arcona, with some 4,500 prisoners on board, burned and then capsized and sank. Only about 600 prisoners survived from the 2 boats. I assume, based on the place, the manner, and the date of his death, that this is how Hans Muehsam died. So these 3 sets of letters give an intimate look into the struggles faced by Jews trying to cope with both Nazi and American bureaucracies as they sought refuge in the United States. They show the cruelty and the arbitrariness of an American system that sought to make it as difficult as possible for those fleeing persecution to enter the country. They show an America that not only placed obstacle after obstacle in the face of increasingly desperate Jews, but that allowed even legally established quotas to go unfulfilled. The writings of Foreign Service Officer Geist show that even when American bureaucrats were able to acknowledge the suffering of the Jews, they remained committed to a policy of obstruction and delay. And not only did they remain committed to that policy, but some of them also specifically called on their superiors not to make things easier. 2 families got out. Hans Werner and his mother Agnes did not. An American immigration policy had a role in their deaths. And there is a lesson here that I'm not sure we have yet learned. Now, before we stop for any questions, if you don't mind, I'd like to stop and share my screen and show a PowerPoint with a few slides of the documents that I found while I was either in our archives or while I was doing the research. So bear with me for one moment as I pull up my slideshow. And hang on a minute till I can get it to show the slideshow, which it doesn't seem to want to do. So I'm just going to have to scroll down. So this first document, and I apologize for the fact that I can't show the actual slideshow because it will not let me click on slideshow. These are some of the newspaper clippings that we found, in our archives that are showing, talking about the sale of this glass collection. And you can see in the picture here, this is Jacques Muehsam, the original owner of the collection. And it's not going to do any, there we go. This next slide is the cover of the New Yorker from 1928. And on the right, you see this is the article written by James Thurber about his visit to see the glass collection. And this article is called In the Museum's Cups. This is the cover of the 1912 printing of the Muehsam family tree from the archives at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. These are the 2 letters. One is in German, one in English, from Eduard Muehsam to his cousin Edward in New York. And this is the ship's manifest showing Edward and Gerhart Muehsam arriving at Ellis Island from Glasgow, Scotland. Here we have Gerhart Muehsam's petition for naturalization that shows, among other things, that he was a private in the United States Army in 1943. And I realize it's very, very hard for you to see, but at least you get a sense of what's there. And this is his father, Edward Muehsam's draft registration card from when he arrived in the United States. And you can see from this card that by this point, he was working at Lakeview Hospital in New York. And this is his son Gerhart's draft registration card. This is one of the handwritten letters from Ernst Schott to his cousin Eduard. And this is the ship's manifest showing Ernst, Hedwig, and Eva Schott on the ship from Yokohama that arrived at Angel Island in California. And this is a picture of Eva Schott on the deck of the ship and a photo of her passport. And if you look at the passport, you can see that her middle name is written as Sarah. But Eva's middle name was actually Erica. The Nazis, however, required that all Jewish women add Sarah as their middle names, and Jewish men were required to add Israel to theirs, and it had to go on their passport. And these are Eva's parents. This is Ernst and Hedwig Schott on the deck of the ship on their way to California. And these are the Schott's petitions for naturalization. And these are 3 letters sent by Hans Muehsam to his cousin Edward in New York. And this is the record of Hans Muehsam's death in the Neuengamme concentration camp that was filed at the Civil Registration Office in Hamburg. And this, finally, is the record from what's called the British Zone List of Persecutees from 1939 to 1947 that shows Hans Muehsam's death by drowning at Neuengamme. And I apologize that I was not able to show it as a PowerPoint, but for some reason my computer refused to let me. So that is the end. I see I've made it just with 10 minutes to spare. I'm happy for any questions. I know Meg is going to moderate, but if anyone has questions, comments, I would be more than happy to answer them if possible. And I'm assuming by now we can all put our cameras back on if you would like.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a question in the chat, Erica, and it is, how did this box of documents happen to end up at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center? Oh, you're on mute, Erica.
Sorry, when you muted everyone, you muted me too. I had no idea.
I'm
that
sorry about
I was
that.
talking and nobody could hear me. And that is one of the great mysteries at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. I don't know. We don't know. The current administration doesn't know. And there is nothing to give a clue. And, I reached out to previous employees of the center and we got a lot of, donations, decades ago. Before computers, before we had, before the center had space, and they were just neatly put in boxes and stored. And clearly this was a box that it's next on my list of things to start digging into to figure out, was there a connection with me? Did Edward Muehsam in New York have a connection? And one of the things I have been able to do is I traced some of the descendants of the Muehsams who are currently, living in the United States. I have not yet reached out to them because again, it took me quite a while, but I'm going to, and I'm going to ask, if any of them know. Should I go through the chat or do you want to go through? I see both chats, questions, and hands raised. So Meg, I'm going to let you.
Great. Eileen, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure.
Hi, Eileen.
Thanks for doing this. And hi, Erica. My question, I'm a little confused about the quota part. You gave some figures very early on, and you said that it was 48 point something, less than half used. And yet in one of the documented cases, they were saying that there was a waiting line or for 3 years or something. Can you clarify that for me? I'm a little.
Yes, absolutely. The waiting was usually to get the appointment to see the consul to go over your visa application. And so Hans's number, I think he was something like 48,000 in line to get, there was that kind of a wait to get in to see the consul to go over the visa application. But these quotas were basically never filled. It was rare that the United States filled a quota, despite the fact that there were more than enough qualified applicants, waiting in line.
Wow.
Does that answer it?
Okay. It does. Thank you very much.
There's a question in the chat, Erica. Did Hans think to contact the Met or Art Institute for help?
I have no idea. I have no, he might have, I do not know. It was not in any of his letters. And, so again, I was only able to go on the letters that I found and what I was able, and trust me, I was on the internet. I mean, I Googled every possible, clue that I could follow up on trying to find information. I was digging around for. So I don't know. I honestly do not know if he was able to contact the Met or the Chicago Art Institute.
Hi. I'm Valerie Silverman, originally from Dexter, Maine. My parents both emigrated here from Germany. My father was a physician who worked in a hospital in Berlin and came to the United States in 1937. And it's possible, I'll mention something to you. I don't know. I'm sure you know who Gerda Haas is, of course.
Oh, yes.
The Haas's were friendly with my parents. And, it's possible you may want to check with the Haas family because Rudy Haas and my dad were about the same age.
Mhm.
And perhaps, I don't know if the Haas's were in New York or whatever, but it's possible that that material may have come through a connection. The other thing is my father was a member, and you might want to check this out too. The records might be at the Leo Baeck Institute, but my father was a member of a German Jewish fraternity called the Katze. Have you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it's possible that these people, Edward and the doctor, that they also were members of this fraternity, and that may have been another connection.
I will take any leads that I can because I really, really want to solve the rest of this mystery.
Yeah, I was curious how that box, I was the one that asked that question, how that box ended up there,
Yeah, me too.
You
We
might
want
to check with the Haas family.
So
Yeah,
I
you might wanna check
am
with
going
them.
to keep digging, and if and when I find out, perhaps I can somehow send it to the library and they can put it, send it out to all of you that, mystery
Yeah.
solved.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions? Yeah,
Um,
Gerda, go ahead.
I saw one in the chat asking me to explain who the Haas family was. Gerda
Yes.
Haas was one of the founders of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. She was a survivor, of the Holocaust, from when she was, a sort of young woman, teenage girl, and she was really instrumental. She came to Maine, and she was instrumental in the founding of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. So,
Thank you.
that's-
All right, other questions?
I have a couple of thoughts. The quotas on immigration are, I believe of course, still in force today. We're limiting immigration. But they were influenced by the American Eugenics Society. And the American Eugenics Society submitted suggestions when the immigration laws first included quotas for different nationalities. And there's a clear connection with Maine to the American Eugenics Society in Clarence Cook Little from Bar Harbor, who was one of the co-founders of the Jackson Lab and was also a president of the University of Maine at Orono. And he was an officer of the American Eugenics Society. I can't remember the exact year, but the American Eugenics Society, there was an international conference and people from countries all over the world came, and the eugenics movement inspired the Nazis and Hitler to want to eradicate all the Jews. So there's a thread that comes back to Clarence Cook Little of Maine. It's also because of Clarence Cook Little's involvement way beyond when many pillars of this country's, wealthy, famous, and entrepreneurs, big companies like Kellogg, figures that everyone knew were members, Darwin, they dropped out of the Eugenics Society. And but Clarence Cook Little stayed in there as an officer for the longest. And this was one of the reasons why his name was removed from Little Hall on the campus of the University of Maine at Orono. So The other thing is that I don't myself know a lot about current immigration law, but I do believe that some of the same requirements are in force today, that someone has to vouch for a person who wants to come to this country and sign some sort of affidavit that they'll support a person who wants to come, so the person won't be a burden or be on welfare. Our immigration laws are again strict and also similar in discriminating against, we just, don't want people coming anymore. So there's similarities or the same requirements today. Just a couple of thoughts.
Any other questions, Gerda? I see you had your hand up. Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, you're still muted, Gerda. Okay, anyone else?
Okay. Yeah,
Yes, okay, good, there.
thank you very much, Erica, for putting this story together. That so many friends of mine I had here in Lewiston, Maine, also among them Gerda and Jutka Isaacson, whose books I translated into German and also edited. When they talked about the difficulties, and many talk about the terrific difficulties and chicanery which they had to endure during their efforts to get away, to get to America. They cannot hear this because at the time in the 70s and 80s, they were hesitant to talk about this very much. Unless we were just among ourselves, they did. And I heard often that the Viennese consulate was worse than the one in Berlin, even. Really, really, really years. Seems to have been a little bit easier in 1938 for German Jews, right? There were a few months they could get out easier and also to the US easier. But then also I have a question. Did you come across Erich Muehsam, a famous,
Yes, I did. I left that piece off. I actually even had a picture of him in my slideshow, but I thought perhaps it was getting a little too, but he was a cousin.
He was a cousin. I was
He was
sure.
a cousin of them. Yes. And for
Sure came
people
from that family.
Yes.
I grew up, born in 45. But he was a really interesting figure for us, younger Germans.
Yes.
Very, very good writer. And I guess he's one of the most famous of these Muehsams. But he died in Oranienburg.
Yes.
That's the concentration camp
Yes.
outside of Berlin.
Yes. Yep. Yes. So for people who might not know, and honestly, it was the last paragraph, but I decided to leave it off but there was a very famous Muehsam cousin, Erich Muehsam, who was an anarchist, an author, a poet, and a publisher who had been born in Berlin in 1878. And in 1917, he was imprisoned for refusing military service. And then he was also imprisoned again as a result of his role in the very short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic. He published anarchist books, plays, periodicals. He was successful as a writer, and he was a cabaret performer. And he was arrested during one of the Nazi roundups of political opponents after the Reichstag fire in February of 1933. And as Gerda said, he was sent to the Oranienburg concentration camp, where he was tortured to death and died in 1934. So yes, he was yet another of the Muehsam family cousins, and is very well known.
Well known among my generation of Germans. Yes.
Right. Not particularly well known, in American society in the 21st century, but for anyone working in the field, of German history, or he is fairly well known. So.
Thank you. Any last questions for Erica? If so, go ahead and unmute yourself. We've got a few pages of participants, so I'm not seeing all of the actual physical hands. All right, well, that was last call. Thank you all so much for being here. And Erica, I'll give you a Zoom round of applause. I mean, it was wonderful to hear the story, and also I'm so grateful for the original research. When I had initially reached out, I was like, I'd love to hear you come and talk, and then to have you dig into such a big project and share it with all of us is really special.
Great.
So we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and I will, like I said, I'll upload this to our YouTube page in a couple of days. Wish you all good health. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.